Alright, on to the insects. Subphylum Hexapoda, insects and their relatives. They have more species than all other forms of life combined. So again, we keep talking about the enormous diversity and numbers of these creatures, but if you want to know who rules the world, it would be insects. There are more types of insects, more species of insects than all other forms of animal life combined. And it says all forms of life. I don't know if that includes plants and everybody, but certainly it does include all species, other species of animal life. They live in almost every terrestrial habitat and in fresh water as well. The internal anatomy of an insect includes several complex organ systems. So again, we're moving up the chain and getting more complex as we go. If we take a look at, for example, a grasshopper, he has a number of internal parts that you would likely recognize. He has a body that's divided into three major sections: a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, compound eyes, various segmented body parts that are used for a various purpose. I guess you could say the most simple version of a brain, a cerebral ganglion, and then a simple nervous system as well, a basic heart, and open circulatory system. So we're starting to see some of the organs that you might expect to see in more developed animals. Most insects, of course, have the ability to fly, and insects diversified several times following the evolution of flight, adaptation to feeding on gymnosperms, and the expansion of angiosperms. So as other habitats have changed through evolution over time, insects have adapted and diversified into these various habitats. Insect and plant diversity declined during the Cretaceous period, but has been increasing in the 65 million years since. So just like a lot of living species were knocked back or made extinct or wiped out at the end of at the beginning of the Cretaceous period, insects were as well, but they have rebounded and have since diversified quite nicely, pretty obviously. Flight is one key to their great success. Unlike some of the other animals like birds and bats, whose wings evolved from existing limbs, you had insects develop flight using wings that evolved from their outer layer, their cuticle layer. So they didn't have to give up walking legs. So they still have all of their walking legs, and they also have wings, which makes them pretty awesome. An animal that can fly to escape predators or find food and disperse into new habitats obviously has an advantage over an organism that cannot. So here's a ladybug showing the usual display of wings, an outer wing and an inner wing underneath to help with flight. Many insects undergo some various similar body development. They undergo metamorphosis during their development. There's basically two different types of metamorphosis. One of them is called incomplete metamorphosis, where the young, which are called nymphs, they resemble the adults but are smaller and go through a series of molts to get rid of that hard exoskeleton as they get larger and larger. So this would be like in a grasshopper. The fertilized egg, once it hatches out, you basically have a tiny little miniature version of an adult grasshopper, and the basic body shape and the way it looks is very similar to an adult, but just quite a bit smaller. And then they have to go through several stages of molting before they're considered sexually active adults. And then you could compare that also to here's a leaf-footed bug. And again, if you were to look at the nymphs, they're slightly different color than the adult, but they have the same basic shape and layout as far as body plan. They're just smaller versions of. So if the babies or the young look like little miniature versions of the adults, we call that incomplete metamorphosis. The flip side of that would be complete metamorphosis, and that would be where the larval stages oftentimes don't look much like, or they don't have the same habitat as the adult. So they are a maggot. A maggot becomes a fly, or a grub becomes a beetle, or a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. These are all examples of complete metamorphosis. The larval stage, like the little grub here, he looks far different, and he lives in a different habitat. He has a different feeding pattern than the final adult beetle does. Some good examples of video, I believe, in the chapter 33 notes of a butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. And then if you've studied insects at all, you've probably studied butterflies, where you have the caterpillar larva. He becomes a pupa, later forms a chrysalis, a later stage pupa. Inside there's an amazing amount of metamorphosis and development going on, and then that becomes the adult, who later emerges as the butterfly. What goes on inside this chrysalis between this larva stage and the adult stage is amazing. You could spend 2 weeks discussing and studying that, because it's probably not what you expect. If you were to cut open a pupa in the middle of this stage, what you will find is not a caterpillar sprouting wings. You will find a mass of goo, of cells that don't seem like they are anything. And it's pretty amazing what's actually going on inside there. But again, we'd need another week to study that all by itself. Most insects have separate male and females and reproduce sexually. Individuals find and recognize members of their own species using colors, sound, smells. Particular chemicals called pheromones are very important in insects. Different insects release different pheromones to attract mates and the like. Some insects are beneficial, of course, like pollinators such as bees, and others are harmful or possibly disease-carrying, like mosquitoes, or pests of crops like grasshoppers. Insects are classified into more than 30 different orders, and there's no way we could study all that we needed to study about insects. Again, that's an entire semester course all by itself. So some video of bees pollinating that you could likely find inside the folder. And then if we wanted an overview of insects in general, you would turn to your textbook on page 690. There's a basic overview of some insect diversity. And again, no way we could study all the variety of insects that we would want to, but if you want a basic overview, you could take a look at some of the basic categories. They'd kind of divide them into incomplete metamorphosis and then complete metamorphosis. On the complete metamorphosis side, you would have, say, Coleoptera, which are all your beetles, which there's 350,000 different species. Your Diptera, which are your flies. Your Hymenoptera, which would be your wasps and your bees. And your Lepidoptera, which would be your moths and your butterflies. And then on the other side, incomplete metamorphosis, you have your Hemiptera, which is your what we call our true bugs. And then you have your Orthoptera, which would be like grasshoppers and the like. Crickets and similar. So take a look on page 690 for a basic overview. I won't hold you to knowing particular details about these insects simply because there would be no way we would have time to study all of that. Finally, in this group of arthropods, let's look at the crustaceans. While arachnids like spiders and insects have thrived on land, crustaceans for the most part have kept to their water environment, their marine or freshwater environment. Crustaceans typically have branched appendages that are extensively specialized. So they will have feeding appendages, and they will have antenna appendages and swimming appendages and all variety of specialized appendages. Small crustaceans exchange gases straight through their cuticle, their outer layer, but the larger crustaceans like a lobster or a crab will have gills for gas exchange. Most crustaceans have separate males and females. There are a couple different varieties, of course, that we can look at. Isopods include terrestrial, freshwater, marine species. The little pill bugs or doodle bugs that you might play with when you were a little elementary school kid out in the sand or the dirt of the playground. Those little pill bugs are a well-known group of isopods, but there's a couple of different marine versions of those as well. And then there's what we call decapods, and decapods are all the relatively large crustaceans, and that would include your lobsters, crabs, crayfish, shrimp. Anything you might eat when you go to the seafood restaurant would be probably a decapod. Some examples of crustaceans here: ghost crabs, krill, barnacles, huge number of varieties. Planktonic crustaceans, which are the ones that are very small and are kind of swept around by the currents of the water, include many species of copepods, which are among the most numerous of all animals. I mean, you have these tiny little krill, tiny little shrimp-like creatures that are fed upon by everybody from small fish to some of the baleen whales. Barnacles are a group of mostly sessile crustaceans. Most of the crustaceans move around, but barnacles are ones that attach to the side of rocks or even the hulls of a ship, or even a creature such as a whale. You can find barnacles living and growing on a whale. They have a cuticle that is hardened into a shell. So this would be a barnacle. And that's where we're going to stop. Alright, so we have hit most of the major categories here. The last categories we're going to look at are called the echinoderms and the chordates, and they are deuterostomes, and that's where we're going to end chapter 33. We'll talk about them briefly. They're going to include the sea stars and sea urchins, and we're not going to get into talking about the vertebrates yet, because that's going to be for the next chapter, but we'll briefly mention some of the others, like the starfish and the like. We'll take a break. Be right back.